Darwin was right about some things, he was wrong about some things. Darwin was completely wrong about genetics, for example. Everything Darwin said about genetics is pretty much flat wrong.
Second, he was wrong, flat wrong, on everything that he said in genetics.
It's really strange to think that the origin of evolutionary theory, they didn't know how genes transmit from one generation to the next. They didn't know anything about, meiosis or mitosis, or they didn't even know that genes were carried on DNA.
If you need genetic mechanisms to make the process of evolution work, but everything that you think that you know about genetics is wrong, this is a huge red flag.
Perhaps you haven't got a full impression of how strong the evidence actually is. It's as though you had 10 million different pieces of evidence, all pointing in the same direction, every single one of them. Nobody's actually seen evolution take place over a long period, but they've seen the after effects, and the after effects are massively supported by evidence, not just one bit of evidence, but hundreds, millions of bits of evidence, all pointing in the same direction. And now we know that, not that Darwin wasn't a great man, he was a hugely great man, but the new evidence that has come in shows that he was wrong about genetics. New evidence that comes in shows that Darwin was right about the fundamental idea that we are all cousins of everybody else.
One question is, would he still be an evolutionist? And the other one is, knowing what we know, would he invent evolutionary theories? Was working in basically the dark ages of science. He didn't know about complexity, didn't know about how things worked, he didn't know how things multiplied, he didn't know anything about genetics.
That the evidence of a book that was written a few 100,000 years ago by somebody who obviously didn't know anything, how could they know anything in those days? You're seriously saying that you take that more seriously than the evidence of fossils, the evidence of DNA, the evidence of geographical distribution, the evidence of comparative anatomy, comparative physiology. Does anybody really want to defend that position? Seriously, there isn't a controversy. There may be a controversy within evolution about certain details, but the fact of evolution is uncontroversial. Yes, but you have to contend with facts, don't you? And, I mean, if evolution is a scientific fact, you might as well be concerned about gravity or the Milky Way. I mean, whether you like it or not, we're cousins of chimpanzees, we're slightly more distant cousins of monkeys.
Takes millions of years, and it will readily admit that it cannot be replicated in an experiment, and so evolution theory requires indirect evidence. Richard Dawkins has poisoned the minds of the youth in this nation, and even in the world over, because he's traveled across the globe to destroy the faith of others.
I mean, the evidence is actually rather substantial. It's not just fossil. If you look at the DNA of all animals and all plants, what you find is a beautifully arranged hierarchy. You find that our DNA is close to chimpanzees, slightly more distant from monkeys, slightly more distant still from rats, slightly more distant still from lizards. The whole thing falls into a beautiful hierarchical pattern, just like a family tree. It is a family tree.
Richard Dawkins is probably the world's most famous atheist, and he claims that there is a mountain of evidence consisting of millions of pieces that all point to one event happening, which would be the birth of life from non-living matter into a single cell, which then evolved over the course of 3 billion years into all of the life forms that we see on the planet today. Every adherent to the theory of evolution believes that it is not directly observable, because it happens over millions of years, so there's no way anybody could observe it anyways. That is something that people who believe in evolution will readily admit. Now, they'll claim that evolution theory is just as good as a fact, not because you can directly observe it, which is what a fact is, but because it has so much indirect evidence. Even though you can't produce the experiment of changing one kind of animal to another, if you could show that the event happened, then you do have something that is credible and reliable.
That's to say, all animals and all plants are cousins of each other. We are cousins of oak trees and kangaroos and wombats. Darwin said that, and he was right. There is no holy book. We don't say, I believe this because Darwin said it. We say, I believe this because all the evidence points in that direction.
About a third of non-intelligent design academic biologists are fed up with Darwin's theory. Yet, it's only talked about in professional journals and meetings. When the public media gets hold of it, it's all Darwin all the time, and it is presented as a united front, that science says that Darwin's theory is known to explain everything. But professional biologists know there's problems.
You have to contend with facts, don't you? And I mean, if evolution is a scientific fact, you might as well be concerned about gravity, or there isn't a controversy. There may be a controversy within evolution about certain details, but the fact of evolution is uncontroverted. I mean, whether you like it or not, we're cousins of chimpanzees, we're slightly more distant cousins of monkeys, etc. I mean, the evidence is actually rather substantial. It's not just fossils, you know. I mean, it's DNA. If you look at the DNA of all animals and all plants, what you find is a beautifully arranged hierarchy. You find that our DNA is close to chimpanzees, slightly more distant from monkeys, slightly more distant still from rats, slightly more distant still from lizards. The whole thing falls into a beautiful hierarchical pattern, just like a family tree. It is a family tree.
evidence from paleontology for human evolution would be to show that the fossils are in an order of least complexity to most complex. Sea-dwelling organisms, and then you go higher in the geologic strata and you'll come to amphibians, and then reptiles, and then mammals, and that's supposed to show how single cells evolved into humans over billions of years. So it could be a matter of geographical distribution of these animals, basically that they're buried by where they live, the ecosystem, the intelligence of the animals, and if we're looking at a global flood, they're going to progressively move to higher ground as the flood waters come in. Animals that live in the ocean are going to be in low layers of strata, and animals that live in high altitudes and mountains are going to be buried in high layers of strata. All of the dirt that the fossils are in came by water, and the best way to get a fossil, preserve an animal when it dies, is to quickly bury it in deeply in mud and rock, and that's the product of a global flood.
Haeckel's embryos are just one little thing. It's a Victorian thing. Plenty of people made mistakes. I don't think it's really fair, is it, to pick on particular Victorian mistakes. It is a Victorian. Talk about intermediates between species. We're of course not talking about intermediates between modern species. We're not talking about intermediates between dogs and cats. We're talking about intermediates between ancestral dogs and slightly more recent ancestral dogs. Now, in the case of humans, since Darwin's time, there's now enormous amount of evidence about intermediates in human fossils, and we've got various species of Australopithecus, for example, and these are, some Australopithecus are intermediate between others and ourselves. Then you've got Homo habilis, Homo erectus. These are intermediate between Australopithecus, which was an older species, and Homo sapiens, which is a younger species.
Let's have a debate. Are we humans evolved from monkeys, or are we God's creation? What is your opinion, and what arguments do you have?
If you look to the left, you'll see the Australopithecus fossils. These are ape fossils, distinguished to be ape fossils. You compare them to a chimpanzee or a gorilla. If you look to the right, you have the Homo fossils, which are the human skulls and have all of the very obvious features of a human skull, such as a nose bone. Apes do not have, and you do not find them in these so-called ancient human ancestors. It's either an ape or a human that you find, and the human fossils are always in the topmost layers. There's no distinguishment between the Homo erectus, which would be modern human skulls, and the ancient ones, other than the fact that they have slightly different shapes. It's obviously different from the Australopithecus, supposed to be ancient human ancestor. It's an ape, is what it is. So if you find in the fossil record, an ancient human ancestor, probably talking about an ape, and then you dig into the fossil record and you find humans.
You think Neanderthals were the only other human species our ancestors lived with? Think again, there were 8. There was Homo floresiensis, often called the Hobbit people because of their size. They were about 3 feet tall and had proportionally large feet, and were alive until about 50,000 years ago. All of their remains come from the cave I've pictured at the bottom, on the island of Flores in Indonesia. We're still unsure if Homo sapiens directly interacted with them, but they were on the island around the same time the Hobbit people went extinct. There were also the Denisovans, who were very closely related to Neanderthals, like cousins. Like Neanderthals, they had a flat cranium, a protruding lower jaw, and a sloping forehead, but they had a wider face. They were from Siberia to Southeast Asia. They were alive until about 30,000 years ago, and Homo sapiens interbred with them. Some people living today inherited 3 to 5% of their DNA from Denisovans.
Oh, the evolutionary process is so painful I can literally feel the molecular restructuring of my cellular biology. What's good, girl? Look at your number. Oh, my back.
Millions of fossils around the world. So with all this evidence, so to speak, it's clear that the fossil record proves evolution, right? Well, actually no. Didn't when Darwin was alive and hasn't since he's been gone. In fact, Chucky D himself knew this when he wrote the following. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. Okay, but surely after all the time since Darwin, digging and discovering fossil after fossil, we have a more perfect geological record that supports evolution, right? Not even close, bud. Listen to how 2 renowned evolutionary biologists summarize the truth. Instead of finding the slow, smooth, and progressive changes, they saw in the fossil record rapid bursts of change, new species appearing seemingly out of nowhere and then remaining unchanged for millions of years, patterns hauntingly reminiscent of creation. The fossil record doesn't show gradual change, and every paleontologist has known that ever since Cuvier. Did the artiste take any artistic license with what I'm looking at here? Check this out, because this happens all the time. Look, isn't that sweet? So cute and fluffy. Okay, why do you think the artist made these creatures appear more human-like by throwing in an affectionate smile and depicting them hanging out like a human family going to a picnic or something? Why did he draw them walking upright? Why make the shapes and colors of their eyes more human than ape? Is any of it based on actual fossil evidence? Of course not. But if you want the story of evolution to appear more convincing, you just might fill in missing gaps with your presuppositional imagination. Just saying. Question 2. Is the attention-grabbing headline or title supported by actual facts? For instance, take a look at this popular book called Why Evolution is True. We don't even have to go any further than the jacket on this one, because on it you got a dino evolving into a bird in 3 simple steps. There you go. But then on the inside, this is written, and I kid you not. The jacket depicts a chronological sequence of fossils showing the evolution of birds. We do not know whether the actual line of descent included, now wait for it, the first 3. Say what now? Doesn't that mean these 3 shouldn't be on the cover then? Which means all you got is a modern bird, right? No evolution, just a bird. Talk about worldview filling in gaps. On to question 3. What do the graphics on evolutionary charts indicate? I mean, they sure do look convincing. For instance, on this one from the dinosaur book, you got solid red columns and white columns showing gradual progression over time. But let's read the almost imperceptible 2-point font over here. It reads, tinted areas indicate solid fossil evidence, which means the white areas represent no solid fossil evidence, right? Okay, then take them away. Uh-oh, looks like patterns hauntingly reminiscent of creation, I'd say, right from their own charts. And the same thing goes for the dotted lines on this one. Look at all of them. Just so we're clear, dotted lines indicate zero evidence. Remove them and what do you get? No transitional forms or evidence of gradual progression. A bat is a bat, a kangaroo is a kangaroo, and a horse is a horse. Of course, unless, of course, the horse is Mr. Ed.
There is individual variation. Every individual, apart from monozygotic twins, is different from every other individual. That's absolutely fundamental to the Darwinian theory. Now, what happens is that among that variety of individuals, some survive better than others, some reproduce better than others. That's how we get evolution. You couldn't have evolution unless there was individual variation.
Polystrata, meaning that there's a fossil going through multiple strata. Now, scientists would say that the strata here is about 2 million years old, but that can't be, because that can't remain intact while that's taking place. Here you've got coal down here, and clay and sandstone and limestone, and so what this says is that this deposition took place rapidly while it went around and surrounded this tree trunk. And that is another proof of a worldwide flood and a young Earth. The inside. This basically was hanging off a cliff with a rope, and for 2 years it turned a felt hat into a heavy piece of rock. This is the same process as the dinosaur bone. What's the difference between the two? Basically, very little. So here's the conclusion. If there was a worldwide flood 4,500 years ago, and dinosaurs lived up until that time, then if they died during that time and the conditions were right for mineralization and fossilization, then the dinosaur bone that I have here in my hand only took a couple of years, as we can see from this hat, to form. And that Genesis is correct. And I'm just going to ask you guys, if this inspires you at all, go read the account for yourself in Genesis in chapters 6 and 7.
And I wouldn't have known that until I came here, a little over 10 years ago and started plotting up data on the continents. And plotting up oil wells offshore, onshore, as much as I can find. And I'm almost done with Australia, which would be the 6th continent. And then you're going to Antarctica. And then we're doing a little bit around, what we can around Antarctica. Right. There's some data. But it really does show, every continent shows about the same thing, the same progression of the flood at the same time, all reaching a peak at about the same time. And very similar layers all over the world, same fossil pattern, the same pattern of fossils, starting with marine fossils, and then mixed land and marine, dinosaur swampy areas, and then you get the upland areas where you get the larger mammals, etc. Other people try to end the flood, I think, a little too early as well, and that's another story. But I think the flood progressed along, and most of the fossils we see are all from the flood.
Homologous structures provide evidence that these animals evolved from a common ancestor. It's found in just about every textbook. You got it in these other ones up here, I'm sure, don't you, Steve? Homologous structures as evidence for evolution. They descended from a common ancestor, textbook says. Think critically. The bones are the same, boys and girls. See, that proves we're related. Evolved from a forelimb of a common ancestor. This textbook says comparative anatomy provides further evidence of evolution. The commonalities suggest that these and other vertebrate animals are all related. They probably evolved from a common ancestor. This is a lie. They probably have a common designer. The different bones in different animals come from different genes on the chromosomes. They're not homologous to begin with, okay? And even if they were, that still wouldn't prove a common ancestor. Proves a common designer.
Let's take the first thing there. I think it was a young lady over there asked about if evolution is a theory, why do we have to say it's a fact in order to get good grades in our GCSE? And I said, I hoped you didn't do anything just to get good grades in your GCSE. Has anybody got an idea how to answer her on that? What does it mean to say that evolution is just a theory? Do you think that maybe theories go through a stage of being theories and then eventually they become facts when it becomes really rather silly not to believe in them anymore? There's a distinction between going into space and actually looking at the world and seeing with your own two eyes that it's round.
Yeah.
Whereas the evidence for evolution is a bit more indirect than that.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, when a detective comes on the scene of a crime, and obviously the detective hasn't seen the murder, because if he had, he'd know. But nevertheless, the detective takes fingerprints and blood samples and looks at footprints and builds up a very, very strong case. And sometimes the case can be so strong, every bit of evidence points in that direction. Can't that sometimes be as good as, or maybe even better than, eyewitness evidence? Because eyewitness evidence can actually be wrong. DNA evidence, for example. Because DNA evidence is the equivalent of the evidence that evolution is true.
Evolution states that all organisms evolved from microbes. But where did the complex DNA that drives evolution come from? Scientists still have no idea how it came into existence. The chance that DNA would spontaneously appear is 1 by 10 for 100,000 or next to impossible.